Well, welcome back to World History and Literature. This is Topic 2 and Week 1. Topic 2, we're going to talk about how the Atlantic explodes into revolts. But this week we need to sort of slow down a little bit, pause. We've looked at the commercial and military revolutions and the shift between traditional history and modern history. We've talked about events and physical changes, but we really haven't talked about the change in thinking, the philosophies, how people saw themselves or thought about themselves, and their place in society. Where does government belong? And what is its place in society with relation to the rest of the population? So for this week, we're going to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to look at authority. Where does authority originate? Where does it come from? So that's where we're going to start. So slow down, get yourself a snack, get yourself something to drink, relax a little bit. This week, we're going to be doing some heavy thinking. So let's begin. So where from does authority come? Well, we looked before in our previous several videos on the absolute sovereignty of kings during the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century, and even in the 17th and 18th centuries, we have this rise in kingship, in rulership, and they sort of adopted this idea that they had absolute control and sovereign rule over everything. Their word was the same as God speaking. And that's kind of where we left off. And I want to go back to that and sort of pick up the flow of thinking politically, in this regard, on the divine right of rule. Where does this authority come from? In particular, the divine right mentality sort of saw its peak in about 1650 to 1750. I know, you're thinking, why do we keep going back and covering the same time frame? We did it with the commercial, we did it with the military revolutions. Now you want to go back and talk about it again. Well, I can't really sort of sum up everything in one video and cover that time period because so much is happening. Not only in science, in the printing press, in the way people live and where they live, but we got to talk about how they think. And this was a really big deal. And it wasn't only a European idea. You had the mandate of heaven that we spoke of earlier, and that was in the Eastern cultures. This idea that the emperor, the ruler of the Qing dynasty or the Ming dynasty, these people, these figures rose to power because the gods, the heavens, bestowed upon them certain gifts and certain knowledge and abilities to better bring the good, the benevolence of the powers that be, the forces that be, into the people's lives. So it's just not Western, although we're going to look in this particular topic in this series of lectures, we're going to look at mostly Western civilization, and that would be the divine right of kings. And of course, although there are many people who wrote during this time, we looked at Bossuet. Earlier, Bossuet was King Louis XIV's court priest or preacher, his theologian. Anything religious, the king would go to Bossuet to go over and get an answer. He lives between 1627 and 1704, and he writes this sort of treaty, this paper essay called Politics, drawn from the very from very holy scriptures. So sorry for my typo there. In this, Bossuet argues that God appoints rulers, and this would be the Christian God. This is not Buddhism. This is not Islam. This is not Confucian. This is Western civilization, which is dominated by the Roman Catholic Church primarily, but the Christian God. And so the Christian God has appointed kings, empowered kings. The ruler represents God on earth and all of God's nature, his goodness, his benevolence, his wisdom. So when the ruler speak or ruled, it was the same as God speaking or God ruling. People had no recourse whatsoever against a bad king, other than just to plead that God would do something, that God would intervene. And that's what Bossuet argues, that, kings, be careful, because God is the one you're going to answer to. You don't represent him right. He's going to step in, and he's going to bring calamity and bad and hardship and judgment on your kingdom. And so the idea being that God can appoint and God can take away. But the people are left sort of just pleading with God one way or the other of a king that might be bad. This is what they call absolute, 100%, no ins or out, no ups or downs, no options monarchy. He is the boss, and nothing can stop him. So the question comes in is, as we see the commercial revolution, the military revolution sort of unfolding during this time, how does this perception of absolute monarchy, of the king being appointed by God and the ultimate ruler, there's no options, you just have to bow down and obey the king, how does this perception shift? And that's what we want to look at, because perceptions were shifting during this time. So we ask ourselves, we got to go back and think, well, under traditional history, old history, the old way of living, who held power? From where does authority come back then? And I think you can classify three areas. One, knowledge. One is force, military might, and the other one's money. And if you had one or a combination of those three, you had a pretty good chance of being the top dog, the one who rules, the one who has absolute sway over whatever happens within your area of influence, whether it be a tribe, a clan, an empire, or just a kingdom. And so we want to take a look at these and see, well, who held the power during the traditional history period. And this is where we find out. We find out that the ones who held the knowledge were the priestly orders. Primarily, the ultimate authority within the knowledge would be the Pope. The Pope was deemed to be the one who received direct revelation, direct knowledge from God, and when he spoke, God is speaking. And so, if there was knowledge involved, knowledge of authority, then the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops and even down to the archbishops, things like that, even the priestly people, the monks, they would be the ones that were the sort of treasure chest holders of knowledge, and therefore they were given certain authority. Military might and force, well, that was usually held by the king or by the nobles, the lords, the knights, things like that. And that's not surprising. Money and wealth was usually held by both the church, by the priests, and the nobles, the kings. And they controlled pretty much everything. All taxes came to them. Offerings and indulgences went to the church, things like that. So money, wealth was in the hands of very, very few. Force and military, very, very few. Knowledge, also the very few. This was a very controlled, strictly exclusive sort of power and authority. But within those powers, there was also a hierarchy of powers. Initially, The church held power over the kings. In this painting, you have the Pope coronating or doing the coronation, crowning the king. And the king would kneel before the church and receive his authority through the church. So in some cases, in some aspects, the church for many, many hundreds of years held a higher authority than even kings. So in the Holy Roman Empire, there were many kings, many rulers, many princes in the various countries throughout Western Europe. But the church, the Pope, held absolute power over all of those. It wasn't until later that as authority dispersed, as we moved from traditional history to modern history, that the first people to gain more knowledge, to gain more might, and to gain more money were the kings, the royalty, the people who were the top dogs in their regions. Once authority is dispersed, the kings sort of rise above the church. We see this in Henry VIII. He wants a divorce because he's not producing an heir to the throne. But the Pope says no. So Henry VIII says, well then fine, forget you. I'm out of the Catholic Church. My country's going to follow its own religion. And so there's this divide, this kicking out of the Roman Catholic Church, so to speak, throughout England. And the King Henry VIII, sets him up as his own head of the church, top of the church. He's not only his king, but he's the top person of the church. So he controls wealth because he refuses to give money back to the sort of the tithes, so to speak, back to the Roman Catholic Church. He stops funding the Catholic Church. So that money's now coming to him. So he's top dog in wealth, top dog in might, and top dog in knowledge now. So that is one example. But let's look at these individually. Let's look at knowledge. Why does knowledge get dispersed? How does it get dispersed? Well, we talked about it before that during this time period of commercial explosion and innovation, we have the printing press. And so knowledge begins to be shared and printed much more rapidly over a wider range of areas. Ideas, innovations, scientific knowledge is starting to be much readily thrown back and forth. It spreads to a much greater number of people. The more people that see that, hey, I can read this, or there's something that I can read, but I'm illiterate. I don't know how to read. So there's schools now. There's an investment into teaching people how to read. And as more and more of the lower class pick up these skills, you see that there is greater knowledge amongst the lower classes as well. One person, Denis Diderot, he got together with some other gentleman and created the first encyclopedia. And that was in 1751. And it looks, it's actually really, really cool because all of the different things that you might find in like a science book or a tech book, a how-to book, you'd find in his encyclopedia. You want to know how to build a grain mill or a windmill. You have pictures and diagrams and instructions on how that's built. Tools, how to spin yarn, things like that. I mean, his encyclopedia was massive. And through 1751, 1763, information is going out to pretty much anybody that can look at a picture. So that's one way, the idea of the spread of knowledge through printed information. But there's also this Reformation period, 1500s moving into the 1600s. This Reformation, this idea that the church, the Roman Catholic Church, cannot sort of hold the secrets of the Bible, of God's laws, of God's rules, the knowledge of God. They can't keep it bound up and to themselves, exclusively to themselves, because until this time, the Bible, their main source of knowledge. The Bible was in Latin, and the common people did not speak Latin, did not read Latin. So the church kind of held a monopoly on the Bible. And if you wanted to know, well, what did God say? What did God do? What does he think? How does he think about people and governments? Well, you had to trust that the priest was going to go over and give you the right information. Sometimes they did. Sometimes it kind of worked a little bit differently, depending on what era we are speaking of. But people started to translate the Bible into common knowledge. People translated, of course, when they did this, they ended up getting killed, martyred, burned at the stake. Luther is one that translated it into common German language. Wycliffe is another one that translated it into English, I believe. Both men were persecuted as a result of doing this, of standing up against the tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. But the Reformation, part of the Reformation, not only was the translation of the Bible, this being able to disperse knowledge more readily, but it was also a new idea, or it was an old idea that had sort of been forgotten, sort of been pushed out. And that was the idea that the Bible taught that all Christians are priests. At least that was Luther's argument. And as a result, when he started to say, well, there is no such thing as a special authority given to a special elect, exclusive group of priests, because we are all priests, therefore we all have authority. And of course, this resulted in many ways in the head being cut off of the Roman Catholic Church throughout most of Western Europe, if not into the New World. Luther wrote, "How then, if they are forced to admit that we are all equally priests, as many of us as are baptized, and by this way we truly are, while to them is committed only the ministry and consented to by us." He goes on, "If they recognize this, that the priesthood is for everyone, every Christian is, every believer, every follower is of the priesthood. If they recognize this, they would know that they have no right to exercise power over us, except insofar as we may have granted it to them. For thus it says in 1 Peter 2, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a priestly kingdom. In this way, we are all priests, as many of us as are Christian." So he blows up this idea that the church is somehow, because they are priests, they are somehow granted exclusive right, exclusive access to this special knowledge, this knowledge of God's laws and the way God operates and things of that sort. And so he blows that out of the water, as do many of his other reformers during that time. Of course, that causes a lot of problem. So the elite, the privileged, the exclusive place of the priesthood, Roman Catholic priesthood, is then bypassed, or in some ways it's completely eliminated. And what results is knowledge becomes universal, and authority then becomes universal. The church no longer, the priesthood no longer have the same perceived authority after the Reformation, during these 1600s, 1700s, as they did for many hundreds and hundreds of years prior to that. So that's a big change. There's also another shift in knowledge, and that is universities are starting to pop all over the place. People are going to go to universities, they're going to learn. Knowledge and learning becomes more open to more people. Fewer or more of the masses are able to attend schools and learning. Royal academies are opened all over the place. We talked about that before under the commercial revolution, when they had problems with navigation or cultivating and harvesting crops, how to do that better. All those things were coming out of the royal academies. and you need people to attend those academies, students to attend. And so knowledge is spreading, scientific knowledge is spreading, which allows people in that field to sort of go down avenues that perhaps they didn't go down before. They may have been restricted prior to that. I think of people like Copernicus and Galileo, who, because of some of the things that they were proposing, the church was able to come in and sort of squish their experimentation and their research and sort of keep it under wraps, so to speak. But now it's starting to explode, and they're not able to keep things under wraps anymore, particularly because of the scientific method that allows new sciences to sort of venture. Now, mind you, there's some, crackpot kind of sciences that pop up during this time too, but overall, you have this explosion of science and scientific knowledge during this time, and it's spread all over the place. What about military force? Well, we talked about in the military revolution the sort of birthing of new jobs, new skilled workers, the artillerymen, the cannoneers, the ones who can fire and project and do the math and make that happen and move the armory in great speed with great accuracy. Sea captains, someone who's able to navigate and command these warships. Logistics experts, how do you move and feed armies of thousands and thousands of people across thousands and thousands of miles of ocean? These were all particular skills, and it wasn't limited to your birthright. It wasn't limited to your nobility. You could, if you were a common ship errand boy that swabbed the decks, so to speak, you could technically work your way up and become captain someday. If you think of stories like the Count of Monte Cristo, he starts off as just this kind of nobody. His family's not really famous. He's not real nobility or anything, but he ends up working his way up to being the captain on one of these company trade ships working for the company. And now that was big. That was a big advancement. And he, 100 years before that, he would not have had that opportunity. He would have been stuck in or limited by his social class. But now they need more. They need people. People are rising up. And so your common man, your common person is gaining access, control, and command of military forces as well, and military knowledge. Money. Money, 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 money. You want to know what's going on in the world? Follow the money, right? Well, old time, you had kings, nobility, and the priests. They were the ones that held all the money. Everybody else kind of worked for them. But with the commercial explosion globally and all the trade going on and everybody getting their fingers in it, we have new banks, we have new personal investors that are putting their own money and making money. We have traders, we have artisans, we have people who are working the fields and owning the fields. This brings new holders of wealth into the global picture. And as that wealth starts to grow, it moves these people out of poverty, out of the lower class, and moves them into a middle space. They're not as wealthy as the king, but they're not poor either. They're in this middle space. Some are upper, some are middle, some are lower middle, but you see that there's a development of this middle class. More people with more money and more control. So, by the 1760s, the sources of authority disperse across the lands and across social classes. It's not just the king and nobility anymore and the priests. Now it's everybody. Another one, commoners gain access to secret knowledge, that biblical knowledge, the knowledge of God, the knowledge of good and evil. There's an explosion of creativity and innovation. Exploration and experimentation take off in all sorts of directions, in many different avenues. And this is with people outside of the nobility, outside of the upper class. And then there again, as I said, there's this development of the middle class. This middle class of people who now have a vested interest in what's going on in the world. So what I want you to do now is just pause the video for a second. That's a lot to think about. Pause the video for a second and ask the question, as authority spreads, as more and more people gain knowledge and knowledge in military and force and have knowledge in money and access to money, how do these people view rights? How does their perspective change? So just pause the video for a second, consider it a little bit, and then come back and we'll keep up. We'll go on and we'll finish and wrap this video up. All right, well, thank you for coming back. Thank you for coming back. Hopefully you've had a chance to think about it. And if you want to, think about it sort of in a personal way. If you're a child and you don't have much money, your scope of interest is pretty much whatever your parents are doing. Whatever they do, the vacation, go someplace, buy something, that's pretty much, you just kind of go along with it. But as you get older, as you mature, you go out and you get your, mowing lawns job, or you work for some company in the region and you start putting money in your pocket. Now what you do with your money is much more personal. And that's what we see happening as more people gain authority, gain knowledge, gain access to military and to forces and might. As they gain wealth, more wealth, personal wealth, we see a shift. The masses are less interested in what the king is interested in, what the nobility is interested in. They're more interested in what's going to be about me. They want to protect their own authority, their own money, their own forces, whatever it is that they've gained in this commercial and military explosion. They want to keep it. They want to protect it. So personal interests outweigh the king's interests. And this can be problematic. Locke says, this is John Locke, John Locke says, men being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent. No one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. And what this is saying is that the natural state of humanity, the natural state of a man or a person is that they are free, they are equal, and they're independent of any outside authority. Locke might argue a little bit that God might have some say over it. He's still living within a Christian world at this time or region. But for the most part, he's saying humanity has a state of nature that is free, equal, and independent of authority. The only time, and we'll go on one more, the only way whereby anyone divests, gives away himself of his natural liberties, what liberties were that? That he's free, that he's equal, that he's independent of any authority. The only way anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of social society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfort, safe, and peaceful living one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties and a greater security against any that are not in that particular community. So he says, we're all free. Therefore we have no authority over us, no rightful authority over us, no divine right of kings sort of thing over us. Instead, people have individual authority, freedom, and equality, that the only way they're going to become under an authority is if they give it away willingly, if they agree to it, sign this sort of imaginary contract, an agreement between the power and themselves, saying, power, I will give you some of my freedom, some of my equality, I'll kind of put you a little bit higher, But in exchange, you are going to protect and ensure that my liberties, the things that I've gained, my wealth, my life, you're going to use your military to protect my life. You're going to protect my right to knowledge and to grow and pursue life more. You're going to do that. That was the agreement. That's the idea that Locke's coming up with, and he starts arguing it in the late 1600s. Another one of these philosophes, these philosophers, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's in 1762, so that's kind of like at the end of our little period. He says, every man having been born free and master of himself, there's that free, everybody's free again, no one else may under any pretext whatever subject him without his consent. Again, nobody can step in and say, I'm the boss over you, I'm the king over you, I'm the authority over you. Why? Because we're all born free and our own masters. He goes on, he says it even a little bit farther. He says, to assert that the son of a slave is born a slave is to assert that he is not born a man. That's kind of funny. If you think about it, what he's saying is, if you're born a man, if you are born into this world, you are born free and the master of your own being. Even if you were the son or the daughter of a slave, you cannot be born into slavery. Wow, that's like a major shocker. That is not what's going on in the world at this time, particularly not in the Western Hemisphere or in the New World or in the Atlantic. That region, that is definitely not what's going on. We got slave trade going on all over the place. And people who are born to slaves are considered slaves. Rousseau's thought is radically opposed to that type of thinking. John Locke is opposed to that. They're establishing this equality of people, this natural state of being as being free and equal. So what I'd like you to do in your own time is, there's a whole bunch of philosophers. There's a whole bunch of philosophers during this time. So find another quote by some of these other ones and look at them. What are they saying? Are there any similarities between? Don't look at Rousseau. We already did Rousseau. But you could look at Lafayette. You could look at Voltaire. You could look at Montesquieu. These are all very, very popular, very notable people. So now you have this picture. You have this idea. There is a shifting in thinking. It's not that the king has absolute power anymore. It's, well, wait a minute, we have the power. We have the authority. The king has the authority, the government has the authority, only when we give that authority to the government. And this type of radical anti-absolute monarchy thinking is going to explode the Atlantic region, not only in Europe, but also in the New World and elsewhere, all over the place, because the age of the democratic revolution is beginning. And we'll talk about that in our next video.